Imagine finding out that your mother was not your mother. Your siblings were not really your siblings. Your name may not have even been your real name. And the woman you were taught to obey, the woman everyone called Mother, had convinced grown adults that she was not only special, but divine. In Australia, one woman built a cult around children she claimed were hers. But many of those children had been taken, renamed, isolated, and raised to believe she was their mother. And for some of them, she was also supposed to be their god. They all had the same last name. Many had the same bleached blonde hair. They wore matching clothes. They lived under strict rules. And from the outside, they looked like a strange but picture-perfect family. But behind that image was something much darker. Fake birth certificates, hidden children, a secluded property in the mountains, psychiatric drugs, LSD rituals, followers who handed over their money, their marriages, and their judgment, and children who were stripped of the truth about who they really were. And you will want to hear this story until the end. Because when police finally stepped in, the most shocking part may not have been what they found. It may have been how little accountability came afterward. This is the disturbing true story of the family cult and the woman at the center of it, Anne Hamilton-Byrne. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is the Echoes and Oddities podcast. And here we uncover the strange, forgotten, and disturbing stories that sound too crazy to be true. History is often stranger than fiction, and this story is just that. It's so unsettling because it really happened behind ordinary doors, around ordinary people, while the world looked the other way. Today we are going to Australia with a case involving a woman who called herself a spiritual teacher and compared herself to Jesus while gathering devoted followers and created what she believed was the perfect family. But that family came at a terrible cost. This is the case of the family cult, led by Anne Hamilton-Byrne. But before Anne Hamilton-Byrne became the woman behind one of Australia's most disturbing cults, before the matching children, before the hidden property, before the spiritual rituals, fake birth records, and police raid, she was born under a completely different name. Her name was Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards. She was born in Sale, Victoria, Australia, in December of 1921. And from the beginning, her life did not look anything like the polished image she would later create for herself. Evelyn was born into a working-class family. She was one of several children, and by most accounts, her childhood was unstable. Her father, Ralph Edwards, was often absent. Her mother, Florence, struggled with serious mental health issues and was reportedly in and out of psychiatric care. Some reports say Florence also claimed to communicate with the dead, which meant that from a very young age, Evelyn was exposed to ideas about spirits, unseen worlds, and forces beyond ordinary life. And at some point during her childhood, Evelyn was placed in an orphanage. Now that detail matters, not because it explains away what she later did. It does not. But because years later, this same woman would build a cult around the idea of family. She would gather children around her. She would rename them. She would tell them they belonged to her. She would create a world where she was not only the mother figure, but the center of everything. And when you know that she herself came from a childhood marked by instability, absence, and separation, it makes the story even more unsettling. Because Anne Hamilton-Byrne did not simply want a family, she wanted to manufacture one, on her terms, under her control. As Evelyn grew older, she seemed determined to leave her early life behind. She did not want to be remembered as a working-class girl from a troubled home. She wanted something grander, something more elegant, something more powerful. And over time, she began to reinvent herself. In 1941, Evelyn married a man named Lionel Harris. They had a daughter named Judith. For a time, from the outside, her life may have looked ordinary: a husband, a child, a home. But then, in 1955, Lionel died in a car accident. And according to later accounts, That loss became a turning point in Evelyn's life. After Lionel's death, Evelyn began moving deeper into spiritual ideas. She later described this period as part of a kind of awakening. And whether that awakening was sincere, exaggerated, or carefully shaped over time, it became part of the story she would tell about herself. Because Evelyn Edwards was disappearing, and in her place, a new woman was beginning to emerge. By the late 1950s, she had changed her name to Anne Hamilton. And this was not just a name change, it was a transformation. The woman who had once been Evelyn Edwards began presenting herself as refined, graceful, spiritual, and almost otherworldly. She became known for her striking appearance, her blonde hair, her elegance, her charm, her ability to walk into a room and make people feel like they were in the presence of someone important. And that is one of the most important things to understand about Anne. She did not look like the kind of person people expected to fear. She did not present herself as dangerous. She was not wild or chaotic. She was polished, soft-spoken when she wanted to be, magnetic. She wore beautiful clothes. She carried herself like someone who belonged among the wealthy and educated. And eventually, she found the perfect doorway into that world. Yoga, spirituality, healing, self-improvement. These were not strange ideas to the people she attracted. By the 1960s, many people were searching for something beyond traditional religion. They wanted meaning. They wanted enlightenment. They wanted answers. And Anne knew how to give them the feeling that she had those answers. She began teaching yoga, and through those classes, she came into contact with people who were not powerless or desperate in the obvious way. Many of them were educated, comfortable, professional. Some had money, some had status, some had medical or legal connections. And that is what makes this case so disturbing, because the family was not built only from people on the edges of society. It was built with the help of people who looked respectable, people who could open doors, people who knew how systems worked, people who could make things happen quietly. And Anne had something they seemed drawn to. She had certainty. She had mystery. She had beauty. She had confidence. And slowly, she began to convince people that she was not just a yoga teacher, not just a spiritual guide, not just a woman with unusual beliefs, but someone chosen, someone divine. The girl born Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards had become Anne Hamilton. And soon, she would become Anne Hamilton-Byrne. But the reinvention was not finished, because Anne was not just building a new identity for herself. She was building a following. And with that following, she would create a world where loyalty mattered more than truth, where obedience mattered more than family, and where children would eventually become the center of her most disturbing dream. Because Anne Hamilton-Byrne was about to meet the people who would help her turn private belief into a hidden empire. And one of the most important people in Anne Hamilton-Byrne's transformation was a man named Raynor Johnson. On paper, Raynor Johnson did not seem like the kind of person who would help build a cult. He was not some drifter searching for attention. He was not a man living on the outside of society. He was educated, respected, connected. He was a physicist, a writer, and the former master of Queen's College at the University of Melbourne. In other words, he was exactly the kind of person who made Anne seem more credible. And that matters, because when people think about cults, they often imagine the followers as people who are foolish, lost, or easy to manipulate. But that is not always how these groups work. Sometimes, the people involved are intelligent. Sometimes they are wealthy. Sometimes they are doctors, nurses, lawyers, teachers, scientists, and professionals. And sometimes, those titles make the danger harder to see. Because if a respected physicist believes this woman has special spiritual power, if medical professionals are sitting in the room, if educated adults are nodding along, then suddenly, something strange can start to look serious. Something extreme can start to look spiritual. And something dangerous can hide behind respectability. Raynor Johnson had long been interested in the spiritual world. He was fascinated by religion, mysticism, psychic experiences, and the idea that science and spirituality might somehow connect. So when Anne entered his world, she did not seem outrageous to him. She seemed meaningful. She seemed gifted, maybe even chosen. And Anne knew how to use that. By the early 1960s, Anne had begun gathering people around her. At first, it did not look like a cult. It looked like discussions, meetings, yoga, spiritual study, a circle of people searching for something deeper than ordinary life. They talked about religion. They talked about enlightenment. They talked about the end of the world. They talked about reincarnation, Eastern spirituality, Christianity, and hidden knowledge. And slowly, Anne became the center of it all. The group began meeting around the Dandenong Ranges outside Melbourne. One of the main places connected to the early group was Santiniketan, Raynor Johnson's property in Ferny Creek. That name, Santiniketan, sounded peaceful. It suggested learning, reflection, and spiritual calm. And from the outside, that may have been exactly how it appeared. A group of educated people gathering in a quiet, beautiful area to talk about life, faith, and higher purpose. But behind that calm image, something else was forming. Anne's followers did not just see her as a teacher for long. Over time, she became something much bigger in their eyes. She taught that she was spiritually advanced, that she had a divine purpose, that she was connected to figures like Jesus, Buddha, and Krishna. And eventually, she claimed she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Not just a follower of Jesus, not just a prophet, but Jesus reborn as a woman. And Raynor Johnson helped give that claim power. He reportedly believed Anne was who she said she was. And within the group, he was seen as a kind of spiritual figure too. Some accounts say Anne identified him as John the Baptist, the one who had come before to prepare the way. And if Anne was the Divine Mother, if Anne was the chosen one, then Raynor Johnson became part of the proof. A respected academic, a man with status, a man who had moved in intellectual circles, standing beside her, believing her, validating her. And this is where the story starts to become deeply unsettling. Because Anne was not only attracting people who wanted spiritual comfort, she was attracting people with access. People who knew how institutions worked, people who had money, people who had medical knowledge, people who understood paperwork, people who could help arrange things quietly. And later, those connections would become crucial. Because the family was not just a belief system, it would become a network. The group eventually became known by different names. Some called it the family. Others connected it to the Santiniketan Park Association. It was also associated with the name the Great White Brotherhood. But no matter what name was used, the center was always Anne. Her teachings, her image, her authority, her voice, her approval. The family blended different spiritual ideas together. There were pieces of Christianity, pieces of Eastern religion, ideas about reincarnation, ideas about purification, ideas about chosen souls, and a strong belief that the world was heading toward destruction. Anne taught that a new age was coming, that the old world would collapse, that only certain spiritually prepared people would be ready for what came next. And this kind of belief is powerful. Because once people believe the world is ending, ordinary rules start to feel less important. Normal boundaries can be dismissed. Family ties can be broken. Children can be treated like spiritual property. And obedience can be framed as survival. Anne's followers were told they were special, chosen, part of something hidden from the rest of the world. And that is one of the oldest traps in high control groups. The leader does not just say, "Obey me." The leader says, "You understand what others cannot. You are awake while the world is asleep. You are part of a higher mission. You are not like everyone else." And once people believe that, it becomes easier to separate them from the outside world, easier to make them distrust anyone who questions the group, easier to convince them that whatever the leader says must be true. Anne understood image. She understood atmosphere. She understood performance. She knew how to look soft and elegant while holding enormous power. She could appear maternal. She could appear spiritual. She could appear loving. But former followers and survivors would later describe a much darker side. A woman who could be cruel. A woman who could be controlling. A woman who could split people apart, rearrange relationships, and make followers feel that their entire future depended on her approval. And as the group grew, Anne's control spread into the most personal parts of people's lives: marriages, children, money, property, friendships, faith, identity. Nothing was fully separate from Anne. If she said a relationship should end, it could end. If she said someone should be with another person, followers listened. If she said a child belonged somewhere else, people obeyed. That is how much power she had. And remember, this was not happening in a world of obvious chaos. That is what makes it so chilling. Many members still appeared ordinary from the outside. They lived in regular communities. Some worked respected jobs. Some had families. Some had status. Some had careers that made them seem trustworthy. And yet, behind closed doors, they were participating in a world where Anne's word carried more weight than conscience. By the late 1960s, Anne and her followers had created a hidden spiritual world with its own language, its own rules, and its own reality. But Anne did not only want adult believers. She wanted something more permanent, something she could shape from the beginning, something innocent enough to mold completely: children. And this is where the family becomes even darker. Because Anne did not just want followers who chose her. She wanted children who would grow up believing there had never been any other truth. Children who would know her as mother. Children who would carry her name. Children who would be dressed alike, controlled alike, and raised inside a world built entirely around her. And soon, through a disturbing network of followers, paperwork, secrecy, and manipulation, Anne Hamilton-Byrne would begin creating what she called a family. But this was not a family built on love. It was a family built on control. A family built on stolen identities. A family built on lies. And the children at the center of it would pay the highest price. By the late 1960s, Anne Hamilton-Byrne had built something powerful around herself. She had followers. She had money. She had spiritual authority. She had educated people around her who believed she was more than human. And most importantly, she had people willing to do things for her. Things that, from the outside, should have raised every alarm. Because Anne did not just want a group of adults who believed in her. She wanted children. Not just one child, not just a normal family. Anne wanted to build something that looked almost unreal. A group of children who would share her name, live under her rules, reflect her image, and grow up believing she was their mother. And this is where the story becomes especially painful. Because children do not choose cults. Children do not choose spiritual leaders. Children do not choose to have their names changed, their families hidden, or their identities rewritten. They are brought into those worlds by adults. And in the family, the adults around Anne help make that possible. Some of the children were born to members of the group. Others came through adoption arrangements. And some were obtained through deeply questionable and illegal means. There were doctors, nurses, lawyers, and social workers connected to the group. People who understood the systems around birth, adoption, paperwork, and secrecy. And according to later investigations and survivor accounts, those connections helped Anne gather children while hiding the truth about where they really came from. Some babies were reportedly handed over by young mothers who were vulnerable, unmarried, ashamed, or pressured. Some mothers may have believed their child was going to a good home. Some may not have fully understood the world their baby was being placed into. And in other cases, paperwork was falsified, names were changed, birth records were altered, and children who were not biologically related to Anne were made to appear as if they belonged to her. Just sit with that for a second. A child could be born into one life, one family, one identity, and then be moved into Anne's world, given a new name, and raised to believe that the woman at the center of the cult was their real mother. To the outside world, Anne could present them as her children. To the children, Anne could present herself as the only mother they had ever known. And to the followers, this could be wrapped in spiritual language. These were not just children. They were special, chosen, part of Anne's divine plan, part of the future she believed she was creating. But in reality, these were children whose lives had been rearranged before they were old enough to understand what was happening. Their pasts were hidden from them. Their biological families were erased or blurred. Their real stories were buried under new names and new identities. And Anne stood in the middle of it all, as if she had the right to decide who they were. The children were given the surname Hamilton-Byrne, and over time, Anne shaped them into an image. She wanted them to look like they belonged together. She wanted them to look pure, orderly, perfect, almost angelic. Many of them were dressed alike. Many had their hair cut in similar styles. Many had their hair bleached blonde. And when you see photographs of them, that is one of the things that makes people stop. Because at first glance, they almost look like a strange, old-fashioned school photo. A neat line of children, matching outfits, similar hair, serious little faces. But then you learn what was happening behind that image, and suddenly the picture feels completely different. Because the matching clothes were not cute. The identical hair was not just a family style. The shared surname was not proof of belonging. It was control. It was image-making. It was identity being flattened until each child became part of Anne's fantasy. Anne was not simply raising children. She was staging a family, a perfect family, a spiritual family, a family where every child reflected her power. And that is one of the most haunting things about this case. The children were not only controlled physically, they were controlled visually. They were made to look like one unit, one project, one carefully arranged symbol of Anne's authority. And inside the family, Anne was not presented like an ordinary mother. She was treated as something much higher. The children were told she was their biological mother, but they were also surrounded by adults who treated her as divine. So imagine how confusing that would be for a child. The woman you are told is your mother is also the woman adults bow to, fear, worship, and obey. The woman who controls your food, your clothes, your name, your punishments, your future, your sense of reality. That kind of control does not just affect what a child does, it affects what a child believes is possible. If every adult around you acts like one woman has all authority, then where do you go with your fear? Who do you tell? Who would believe you? Who would protect you when everyone around you seems to belong to her? The children live much of their young lives away from the ordinary world. One of the most important places in this story was a property near Lake Eildon in Victoria. It was known as Lama. Some called it Up Top, and that name alone gives you a feeling of separation. Up top, away from town, away from regular life, away from people who might ask too many questions. To outsiders, the property may have looked like a secluded rural retreat, a quiet place in the mountains, a place where children could grow up close to nature. But for the children inside the family, isolation was part of the control. They were homeschooled. They had limited contact with the outside world. They did not grow up with the normal freedom of school friends, neighborhood life, or relatives who could quietly notice something was wrong. Their world was small, and Anne was at the center of it. The adults around them were often called aunties and uncles, but these were not ordinary family members. These were followers, people loyal to Anne, people who helped enforce the rules, people who participated in the system that kept the children cut off from the truth. And that is what makes the story so unsettling, because the family did not need to hide in a cave or live completely outside society to keep control. It had something much more effective: a closed world, a shared belief system, a leader treated as divine, adults willing to obey, and children who had no real way to compare their lives to anything else. For the children, this was not a cult. It was home. It was all they knew. If they were hungry, that was normal. If they were punished harshly, that was normal. If adults obeyed Anne without question, that was normal. If they were told their real mother was Anne, that was normal. Because children believe the world they are given, until something cracks. And for years, Anne's carefully built world held together. The followers kept believing. The children kept growing. The image of the perfect family continued. And on the surface, everything looked controlled. But underneath that control was fear, confusion, pain, and questions that some of the children were beginning to carry quietly inside themselves. Questions like, why did everything have to be hidden? Why did the adults fear Anne so much? Why did love feel so much like punishment? Why did being chosen feel so lonely? And why did the family they were told was perfect feel like a prison? Anne Hamilton-Byrne had created the image she wanted: a house full of children who carried her name, children dressed alike, children cut off from the world, children raised to believe she was their mother. But building the image was only one part of the story. Keeping it in place required something darker: discipline, fear, punishment, drugs, and a level of control that would leave survivors carrying the weight of that childhood for the rest of their lives. Because inside Anne's so-called perfect family, the children were not living a dream. They were surviving a system. And this is where the story gets even darker. We will explore that in part 2, where we'll discuss the stolen lives of Lama.